Good afternoon. Welcome to the webinar for this afternoon. We're going to give folks just a few seconds to hop on. Takes a while for people to load into the Zoom room. So I am Michelle Wagner with NAMI New Hampshire, and I work on the First Episode Psychosis Early Serious Mental Illness Initiative. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar titled Exploring the Mental Health Impact of Modern Marijuana. This presentation is being recorded. You're going to be able to find it on the education page of onwardnh.org. In the next couple of days, you're going to get a follow-up email that's going to have links both to an evaluation, which we hope you'll fill out, and also to the recording. So you can watch this again or share it with friends and family. This is a Zoom webinar. That means your camera and microphone are off. The question and answer feature is working, so please enter any comments or questions you have there. My colleague, Michelle Watson, is also with us today to help field your questions. In addressing the topic of marijuana, we know there are many varying opinions. Today, we're going to keep our focus on the mental health effects of modern marijuana, particularly the impact on psychosis. Please do keep that in mind as we go along in our discussion. And now I'm going to go ahead and introduce our presenters. Joining us is Dr. Cornell Stanchu. He is the Director of Addiction Services at New Hampshire Hospital and an Assistant Professor of Psychiatry at Dartmouth's Geisel School of Medicine. Also with us is Harrison Bryan, who is a certified peer support specialist for the Step Up, Step Down program at Connections Peer Support. He's a person with lived experience and also happens to be my oldest son. So thank you both for joining us today. How our format is going to go today is Dr. Stanchu is going to go first. He has a PowerPoint presentation he's going to share with us and talk about the science behind this. And then Harrison is going to share his personal journey with us. So Dr. Stanchu, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, let me share my screen here, making sure everyone can see it. All right. So thank you for inviting me to discuss this very important topic. It's an area that myself, as a addiction psychiatrist, I run into quite a bit of number of times. I work with patients with mental health, addictive disorders who happen to also consume cannabis. Some may have some perceived benefits, others may experience harms. So it's important to have a balanced view at the topic and to understand how cannabis impacts those with mental health. We're hoping to, over the next few minutes, review some of the epidemiology data, looking at the relationship between cannabis, mental health, the associations, look at some of the neurobiological underpinnings, how the endogenous endocannabinoid system works, and then look at some of the clinical trials that have used various cannabinoids in clinical populations with psychosis, anxiety, and mood. And of course, at the end, hopefully, we'll be able to have better, more informed collaborative conversations. Conflicts of interest. I have served in the past on the Therapeutic Cannabis Medical Oversight Board. I also have published on various issues related to cannabinoids and mental health. However, I do not have any financial conflicts to report here. And this right here is the cannabis plant. The reason why we're talking about it today. It's a botanical that's indigenous to Asia, central and eastern part, also some parts of Russia. And it has different types of strains that you might be familiar with. The sativa, which is a very tall plant, narrow leaves, tends to be used by the indigenous population more for its uplifting effect. It has very high concentrations of the psychoactive ingredients. Then the indica, which is a shorter shrub, a little bit fatter leaves, tends to be used for its relaxing effects, higher concentration of THC, which we often tends to assimilate with the potency of the plant, lower CBD, which is another cannabinoids we'll see later on. And then we have the rudialis, which is a less commonly encountered plant, smaller. You find that primarily in parts of Russia. In recent times, we have seen that these type of species are not so well defined. We have various type of breeding in between them, so we get various types of strains that may be combination of them. Also, some extracts and other preparations. And an interesting trend, as I mentioned, we tend to look at THC as the potency of the plant. We have seen that from the 90s up until today, the potency has increased drastically. The average leaf used to have about 2 to 3% of THC back in the 90s, whereas now it can have 15 or 16%, just to get an idea of how things have changed. And of course, we have some of the commercial preparations which extracted from the plant and can be even more potent. And this being a botanical, it has many different constituents. Cannabinoids, which is where the THC, CBD falls in, are just a small component. We have about 483 components that we don't even know what they are in this plant. So individual plants can vary in terms of this tremendously. To quickly review some of the historical background as to how we got here, its use goes back many years ago. First mention has been in the 2900 BC, when the Chinese emperor claimed that cannabis possesses both yin and yang. So its use in a way restored the health of the human body and that balance that is needed. It's also got some roots in ancient Egypt, where it's been used medicinally for glaucoma, managing various types of inflammatory conditions, and some parts of India. We see here in this picture to the right, a gentleman crushing the leaves and then straining them to prepare something called bhang, which is a drink that can help with a variety of maladies. It was later in the 1800s introduced to the western part of the world, primarily in the UK, by William O'Shanassy, who brought it over and used it to treat various types of muscular cramps, convulsions, epilepsy. And there is also mentioned around that time that a French psychiatrist was experimenting with it to treat various psychiatric conditions such as insomnia, seizure disorder, and also to help with some analgesic effects. Later on, after it was introduced to the United States, it was put in the pharmacopoeia as a good treatment for a variety of ailments, including alcohol use disorder, opioid addiction, insanity, which right now we know a little bit more about than just that broad category. And these type of preparations were developed by pharmaceutical companies and available by prescription. Doctors could theoretically prescribe cannabis to their patients. And that was definitely on the rise until in 1937, the Marijuana Tax Act was introduced, which imposed some taxations on growers, sellers, but also required doctors who are prescribing it to register with federal authorities, pay an annual fee, and it started to become a little bit more tightly monitored. And then the prescriptions declined. The risk of various harms emerged. It was subsequently removed from the pharmacopoeia in 1942. And then when the Controlled Substance Act came into place, it was put in Schedule 1, just like heroin, LSD, and other substances with abuse potential. Pharmaceutical companies continued to explore this plant. They extracted various cannabinoids, and Marinol was actually the first one to be developed as a pharmaceutical for cancer-related treatment-resistant nausea, vomiting, and weight loss. The general population, however, did continue to use it recreationally and to self-manage various ailments. SAMHSA, NIDA did put together some position statements indicating that due to lack of research, there's no studies that would support that it's any better than the available medical treatments. But most recent national surveys suggest that 15 to 20% of the Americans still use it. They use it either on a daily basis or every so often. And that's what gave birth to some of the states taking action to decriminalize it or to form these therapeutic cannabis programs where one could be certified for several indications, or where one could use recreationally. We see here in New Hampshire, we have the therapeutic program right now, but our neighboring states also have indication for just straight recreational use. Looking at some of the associations that are starting to emerge. Here we see the results of this summer style study where they went out in the general population, surveyed those who endorsed cannabis use. And they found that a pretty good chunk, in fact, just over 50% are using for recreational use only. 10% are using for medicinal reasons. But as we can see from this graph, the majority of individuals do tend to use for multiple reasons, both recreationally and medicinal. So there is a bit of overlap there. And that percentage is about 35% that we can see here. When those individuals were asked what are the benefits that they use for medicinally, the majority of them have endorsed using to manage pain, various type of spasms, but almost half of them endorsed using to manage stress, anxiety, depression, so symptoms of mental health. And they perceive this as being relatively safe, even in conditions such as pregnancy. The National Survey on Drug Use and Health comes out every so often and looks at associations between substance use and various mental illness. And what we can see here is that the majority of individuals who use substances do tend to have mental health related conditions. It's a big overlap. And the severity of the mental illness is proportional to their dependence on the substance. And that is the case as well for cannabis. The use in general has increased significantly in recent years, particularly among the age group of 26-year-olds and also among females. In fact, it is the most commonly used illicit substance among pregnant females. And with use, so does the risk of developing a dependence, being able to meet all the criteria outlined in the DSM for an addiction. In fact, one study outlines that out of those who use daily regular cannabis, about 30 to 50% of them can develop what we call a cannabis addiction, according to our diagnostic standard. Looking at some more association data, and again, this is association. Association doesn't imply causation. But we see that of those who do have a dependence to cannabis, a significant proportion has tremendous mental health conditions as well. Most commonly are mood, anxiety, depression. If we were to look at opioid or any other substance use disorders, it's not shown here, but would be much higher than the mood disorder here. And same with the psychotic conditions such as schizophrenia, that would be much higher. There's other studies, and I can list a lot more here in the general population and other specific subgroups, looking at associations between those who use cannabis and what issues they develop. It's known that among general population, those who use cannabis tend to have more documented suicide ideations, attempt, and death by suicide. In the adolescent population, the risk of depression, suicidal ideation tends to be correlated with cannabis use. And in veterans, suicidal ideations and attempts. And these are just a few association studies. There is a group, the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, who looks at all these information and compiles some recommendation, again, on associations. And they found that use of cannabis is statistically significant associated with development of schizophrenia, other types of psychosis. And there's also fairly good evidence of association between cognitive performance of those that have schizophrenia-like spectrum and cannabis use, development of mania, hypomania among those that have bipolar-induced cannabis, depressive disorders, suicidal ideations among those with depression, and increased social anxiety and cannabis use. So definitely there are associations, cannabis use and mental health conditions. Association doesn't necessarily mean causation. There's some plausible interactions. There could be a shared risk while one with a mental health condition may need to use cannabis. One that uses cannabis may have a predisposition to developing psychiatric conditions. Plenty of different hypotheses. And it would be helpful to learn more about the impact of these cannabinoids, the constituents of the marijuana plant, on our body. But first, we need to look at what are cannabinoids. And there's three different types, three different categories. One of them are the endocannabinoids, which our bodies produce, and they serve as neurotransmitters to communicate between different nerves in our central nervous system. And there are two different ones that we know. One of them is the anandamide, or AA, and the second is 2-arachidonyl glycerol, 2-AG, which is also found in the brain, but mostly in our bodies. So those are the cannabinoids that our body produces. We also have phytocannabinoids, which are derived from plants, and that's where THC, CBD, and many, many others are categorized. And we can have synthetic cannabinoids, such as the pharmaceutical grade dronabinol, or the spice and the synthetic cannabis. And this is what we can see as to where this cannabinoid system is found in our bodies. If you are to look at those endocannabinoids as being the key and the receptor as being the lock to where they bind, we see that we find these locks, the CB1 cannabinoid 1 lock is primarily found in the brain and to some extent in our peripheral tissue. The CB2 is found primarily in immune tissues and to some extent in our brain as well. And what we know is that when these cannabinoids produced by our bodies bind to CB1, it regulates the balance in terms of our motor activity, balance, how we move, how we think, how we coordinate activities, our appetite, memory, how we perceive pain. And of course, when they bind to CB2, it regulates immune response, helps us fight inflammation and so forth. If we were to look at where these types of receptors are distributed, so we're referring to the ones that are in our brain, this is a slice of our brain, we see that the CB1 receptors are present on neurons that are either excitatory or more calming, more inhibitory. And it regulates all kinds of functions. The structures highlighted here in green are responsible for our metabolism, are responsible for our reward system, for pain perception, for experiencing pleasure, for experiencing joy, for being able to balance and move and coordinate movement. So CB1 receptor certainly plays a tremendous role in our bodies. And more to understand more about how these functions normally, we see here, I know this can be a little bit intimidating. This is how two neurons interact with each other to release a signal. So at the bottom first, you have an action potential that triggers something to happen at the neuron that's responsible for initiating action. And that releases the neurotransmitter in between them, which can then lead to another action on the second neuron to cause biosynthesis, to cause the formation of the two endogenous cannabinoids. These are the ones that our body produces, and these cross over, and then they act on the CB1 receptor. Here we see it on the other neuron, which can then lead to inhibiting the release of the first neurotransmitter in the first place and to terminate its action and restore that or keep that balance from just going completely awry. And it also triggers another action here, number 8, which further leads to take-up of those two endocannabinoids and degradation so that the action is terminated. So this is how our body normally functions. Now, if we were to think about if we introduce external cannabinoids, so like the THC, the CBD, this can be a little bit dysregulated because we wouldn't have the ability to initiate these actions and then the degradation. So it can certainly lead to an inability of our system to terminate the action initiated here. And this is what this slide shows here. The phytocannabinoids do interact with the same receptors, the CB1 receptors. They interact with the CB2 receptors, as well as other systems in our body. The role of CBD is not as well documented, but it's still there, still plays a significant role, acts on the serotonin system, acts on systems responsible for pain perception, may actually inhibit this enzyme here that degrades the naturally occurring cannabinoids. So it's a lot to certainly consider. If anything, I just want you to get an appreciation of how the external cannabinoids interact with what our body is doing. There's been some studies where we looked at healthy volunteers, people who don't have mental illness and who were exposed to various tasks. So here they took images of one's brain when they're exposed to a task or images that may be fearful and how they experience that emotion. And typically what happens, you get activation in an area of your brain called the amygdala, which is the structure responsible for emotion, and then also some activation in the memory formation. That's why a lot of people may have traumatic images after exposure to something like that. And pre-exposing them to CBD prior to that task leads to a lower activation of the amygdala, so people don't perceive those images as fearful. And pre-exposure to THC actually increases the region responsible for memory formation. So it may actually lead to experiencing that fearful task more pronouncedly and registering it in their memory. Looking at how these structures connect, we really get the same impression here that CBD can be in a way somewhat protective, whereas THC may enforce the reaction that we have to fearful images. There are studies also looking at the different receptor variances between people that have mental health related issues and those who not. And going back here to this slide, there can be several variances based on our genetic makeup. Variances in how we synthesize those endocannabinoids, variances in how the receptor interacts here, and variances in how we degrade the endocannabinoids that may make one predisposed to having a depressive disorder. So the role of the endocannabinoid in anxiety, depression certainly is well established, not so well understood, however. And what I have here, now that we talked about associations, I want to spend some time to talk about causations. So causations meaning not so much looking at cohorts of people that have mental illness, use cannabis, but also looking at people that have mental illness and are exposed to cannabis in a controlled setting. And these only come from clinical trials, where basically you get a group of people with mental illness, you expose half of them to a treatment, the other half to a control, and you evaluate the outcomes. That's the gist of clinical trials. And my team and I looked at undertook two different projects. One looking at anxiety, depression, PTSD, the other one looking at schizophrenia. And what we did is we analyzed all controlled clinical trials that pertain to such. And I put here the pyramid just so you get an understanding of how we in medicine evaluate evidence. So at the bottom of the pyramid, the lowest level of evidence, more so expert opinions, maybe case reports, maybe a physician had a patient that benefited from cannabis, they would publish it, or maybe had a patient that did not benefit, they would publish it. You go further up, you have a case series where you have more patients. Then you have cohort where you look at more retrospective information. And then you have the controlled trials that I talked about. But at the top of the pyramid, you have systematic reviews where a group of experts looks at all clinical trials, some that maybe showed benefit, some that didn't, and then they come up with the conclusion on whether the treatment is beneficial or detrimental. And that's exactly what we did in these two projects here. We looked at all the clinical trials in efforts to understand the impact clinically on patients with mental illness. And these are all the studies that met our inclusion criteria for review for anxiety, depression, and PTSD. The first one up top looked at administering CBD by mouth, 300 milligrams, to individuals that were of teenage age, and they had social anxiety disorder, and they found that it did have some positive impact over the course of 4 weeks in decreasing their anxiety. Second one, they did the same thing, as well as the third. However, this was a single dose of CBD prior to either public speaking or some social anxiety trigger, and they found some benefit. So this is just a one-time dose administration. There's also 3 studies that looked at a synthetic version of cannabinoid very similar to THC called Nabilone, which when administered to patients who have just general anxiety, this were done in the 80s, so we didn't have the categories. And one found improvement, the other one didn't find improvement. And these were fairly okay in terms of the length, 5 weeks long, one of them. In terms of PTSD, when they took the synthetic cannabinoids, administered it over 7 weeks, they found that people with military trauma tend to have less nightmares. So that was fairly interesting. However, the 2 studies that were done on individuals with bipolar, unipolar depression in the 70s, where they took THC and administered it, found that there was no benefit. However, individuals did, about 50% of them experienced significant anxiety, panic attacks, and some even developed suicidal ideations. So there seems to be some evidence of harm there for THC in those with bipolar, major depressive disorders. The second project, that pertaining to schizophrenia spectrum, we looked at the same thing, randomized controlled studies involving THC, which there were only 3 of them. One study was involved more giving a one-time dose of intravenous THC, and what they found that individuals with schizophrenia had worsened memory in terms of both their verbal recall of information and learning that information, and also experienced positive symptoms such as perceptual disturbance, hallucinations. They had more panic episodes, and interestingly, they felt like they were more rigid, which can be a side effect of medications for it. They also looked, the other two studies also looked at imaging for patients with schizophrenia exposed to THC. And they found that so the hallucinations increased, and this correlated with increased connectivity in your brain between the areas that are responsible for that. So again, THC seems to be harmful in schizophrenia patients. Outside of these studies, there are some hypotheses that using CBD before giving THC can be somewhat protective against these, but I don't have any data to show on it. The studies pertain to CBD administration in schizophrenia seems a little bit more promising overall. There was one case series where they administered CBD for 6 weeks by mouth to 3 patients. One had improvement in the psychosis. The other one didn't have benefit. The other one did not have statistically significant benefit. And the other studies show similar patterns that THC can improve basically psychosis in schizophrenia. It can have a protective effect. And interestingly, this one study here, the third one down, shows that it can, in a way, act as a antipsychotic, both by itself and helping out another antipsychotic. It has less side effect profile, less movement disorders, less weight gain. So there's some interesting evidence there. And the last few studies basically replicate what I had just mentioned. CBD seems to have some mixed but more positive impact on those with schizophrenia. So what do we know? Certainly, THC is the component of the cannabis plant that's responsible for the euphoria, the addictive potential. It can lead to some memory impairment, especially in those with psychoses. Can exacerbate anxiety, especially in those that have anxiety disorders underlying. Can lead to hallucinations, perceptual disturbances, paranoid thoughts, especially in those with psychotic conditions. And it can also speed up the onset of development of schizophrenia, as well as worsen the prognosis in those that are predisposed to such a condition. CBD seems to have more of a protective effect. It opposes the negative effects of THC. It tends to have more of an antipsychotic effect, although that definitely should be studied a lot more going forward. It tends to improve cognition, level of function in schizophrenia, can be anti-inflammatory, can have an anti-anxiety role, and of course, it's also got good evidence that it can help with seizures. Well, we don't know. We don't know exactly, because it's so difficult to design trials where one uses whole plant. We don't know what whole plant would really do. We don't know what the edibles, other concentrates, other products that are completely unregulated could do. And also, we see here on the right, it's a chart that shows how various cannabinoids can impact how your body processes medications. So various components, THC, CBD, can speed up the breakdown of medications like antidepressant medications used to treat schizophrenia, or it can slow down their breakdown, leading to their toxicities. So we see here THC inhibits one of the enzymes and could increase the toxicity of things like popular medications, Cymbalta for depression, amitriptyline for depression, Clozaril, Haldol used for schizophrenia. It can increase the levels, leading to toxicity. CBD only inhibits. So same thing. It can have an impact on populations that are on this type of medication. So we need to be mindful. We don't know the extent to what these two components can play, but we definitely need to be mindful of the plant-drug interactions. So to conclude, certainly we've seen an increase in use of cannabinoids by the general population, as well as those with mental illness, who certainly tend to use to a greater extent. There's low perceived risk of harm. And right now, although we're starting to understand more about the endocannabinoid system in our brains, how that interacts with the psychiatric conditions, we just don't have enough evidence to even condone the use of these cannabinoids at this time. There is a knowledge gap. We know that certain conditions are harmed by cannabinoids. For example, what we've seen schizophrenia with THC, some depressive disorders, and others. So going forward, I'm a big proponent of the more studies, more exploration. We need to use this botanical to our advantage, isolate what can be helpful, run them through trials, and find out the dose, the indication, the route of administration, in order to best help our patients who are suffering from conditions like that.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Stanchu. It was fabulous information. I'm sure we'll have some questions on that. And now we're going to turn it over to Harrison, who's going to share his journey with mental health and substance use, marijuana in particular. Harrison?
All right, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm gonna start when I was in high school. Virtually no substance use in high school. I had a couple of failed attempts. I think at one point I got a bag of oregano. I was with a friend who was smoking a joint. I didn't smoke it. And I actually remember writing a letter to my friends because I felt so guilty that I almost smoked, and we just didn't do that. Coming, in high school, that my addiction really started with video games. I played video games for the last 2 years of high school and had some very terrible sleep patterns. There was a lot of isolation and a bit of anxiety as well. As a young adult, I ended up moving out on my own when high school was over. I didn't know what I wanted to do, so I wasn't going to go to college and waste money that would go nowhere. So at 18, moved out with a couple of friends, started doing a little bit of drinking, some marijuana use, not daily, but more recreational. About a year this went on, I started smoking cigarettes, and ultimately, as I became 19, 20, somewhere in there, started experimenting with some harder drugs. As far as marijuana use, that was sort of dependent on my connect, which is, someone who your dealer basically. So if I could get it, I could get it. If I couldn't, I couldn't. And I was still using other substances at the time. From about, once I turned 22, I was mostly smoking weed. I had a psychotic break. I was living in Manchester for about, let's say about 3 or 4 months. I was just basically using substances and staring out the window. I ended up coming back to Concord. I stayed with my mother starting in, I think it was April of 2020. And in June, middle of June of 2010, excuse me. In the middle of June of 2010, I ended up having a psychotic break. I was hospitalized quickly, and about 3 or 4 times between June and August, September. Got on a CD. So anybody who doesn't know what a CD is, it's basically like a contract you have with the hospital that says you can leave the hospital so long as you keep your appointments, you stay sober, and you take medication. So, and I didn't really have much choice in the matter. So, as far as marijuana use at that point, I actually stopped using marijuana because I was worried about they had the ability to drug test me at any point. So I was very anxious about that. So I started, over the next couple of years, I just smoked synthetic marijuana. So yeah, I mean, starting in 2012, I resumed smoking weed. I had come over to the Seacoast. My entire family had moved to the Seacoast. I was still in Concord, and I was going nowhere fast. like the start of 2013, about January 2013, is when I really made like a first serious attempt to get sober. I had been homeless for a couple of months that winter. I ended up staying with my mom again, and I was trying to control the use. It had become such a habit. It was a way of life. It was part of my routine. It's just what I did. It's what a lot of people, growing up in my generation did. It's just one of those things. And my mental health symptoms were pretty bad. I had delusional thoughts all day long, grandiosity, all that. And just sort of long for answers. My brain wanted answers to questions that nobody has the answer to. And because of the marijuana use, it sort of exacerbated that, I believe. The family treatment team were encouraging sobriety. And, between 2013 and up until just about 2.5 years ago, I had some bouts of sobriety here and there, but I would always back to the marijuana. And I had insight because when I would get sober, there was something that inside me that told me what I was doing was detrimental to my health. So I would try to get sober, and I would get it for a few months here, a few months there. I had almost 2 years at one point. And ultimately, through my sobriety, I wouldn't start to feel better. And so my brain would tell me, oh, maybe this isn't working. And I would start smoking again. So it was this constant struggle of like, it's working, it's not working. And I wanted to be able to control it like other people or just use it recreationally. There were many times where I started smoking again, and I said, you know what, like I'm just going to do it once a week, or I'm going to do it once every 2 weeks. And I may have been able to do that very briefly, but it would just very quickly be a daily habitual thing again. So I wasn't able to control it. It controlled me. And as far as coming off it, I was hospitalized from July 3rd to August 24th in 2021. Probably the roughest year of my life. Very, very difficult. I ended up getting out of the hospital. And when I was in the hospital, I told myself, I said, like, you're going to have to change a lot. Like, you're going to have to change a lot of what you're doing because a lot of basically everything I was doing was not helping. So I talked to my mother on September 19th. And for the upteenth time, she had told me, I don't believe the marijuana is helping. And ultimately, I stopped smoking weed. I stopped using my vaporizer. I stopped smoking cigarettes, and I quit drinking coffee all within about a month of each other. Just dropped all of it. And yeah, I for the last um, 2.5 years since then, I've been sober. I For a while I had breathing difficulties when I was younger, starting at 16. And so I ended up, over the course of my life, using a lot of inhalants, and smoking weed and smoking cigarettes. And when I stopped using all those inhalants, my breathing got better. Um, and ultimately, I ended up back in the hospital in December, but I did not get IEA'd. I was able to get there on my own and ended up getting on meds that actually work. So I don't deal with delusions really anymore. I don't deal with psychosis. I don't really, I don't deal with voices. Um, I mean, it's truly been a blessing. And I wasn't, even if I were to find like the right medication before, I, it wouldn't have worked if I was actively using. It just wouldn't. You can't, I can't do things like that and expect to recover. And if at this point, if I go back to marijuana, I'm just putting fuel to the fire again. So ultimately, my life now is pretty good. I don't have any cravings, which is a blessing as well. I play a whole ton of pickleball along with quite a few folks across the United States. I actually love my job. I work with other people who have mental health conditions, and it's something that I've wanted to do for a while. I just didn't know how I would do it. And since I got sober, since I started getting healthier, opportunities have sort of opened up to me, and feel like I have like some type of purpose now. Love to go to work, love to be there. and I'm living a fulfilling life at this point. You know, not a perfect life, none of us are, but it's a life that I never thought I would have for a long, long time. So thank you. That's about all I have to say. And yeah.
Thank you, Harrison. And here go hearts and clap hands for you. As the parent who was on this journey along with Harrison, I can share my perspective a little bit. And it was incredibly painful to watch Harrison go through this battle. And I can tell folks that I feel like I did everything wrong because people think, am I doing it right? Am I saying the wrong thing? Am I doing the wrong thing? I badgered him to stop using. Yeah, I did lots of things looking back I would not do. And Harrison has still come around to the point where he is sober. He's not using substances. He is very invested in his mental health recovery and his substance use recovery, and he's on a great path. One of the things that happened when Harrison, he was talking about his last hospitalizations were in 2021, so the summer, and then in December when he got on a medication that finally truly helped when he was substance free. When he got out of the hospital, he went right back to marijuana use, even though he had said to himself, I know I have to change things. I know I do. Came out and started smoking right back in it again. And the one thing that I had learned was to not tell him what he should do, but to use those I statements and talk about what I was observing. And so that wonderful morning, September 19th, when we had that conversation, and I said, I can't say what's going on for you. Only you know your thoughts and feelings and how you feel inside. But my observation is that you seem to be more anxious since you came out and started using marijuana again. I said I could be wrong. That may not be the case. Only you know what's going on for you and how you feel. Because I had learned enough over the previous 12 years of saying everything wrong to know I needed a different approach. And it wasn't to tell him what he should do, but to tell him what I thought I was observing. And he decided for himself. And I think he and I have had discussions about this, that there were little chinks in the armor of thinking that marijuana was the solution. Things were said by other people. He'd gotten other information along the way. But ultimately, he had to decide for himself that this was an issue and that it needed to change. So with that, we have some questions. And Dr. Stanchu, do you have anything you want to add to Harrison's story or any questions?
No, I think what you said is definitely very in line with what we do as addiction psychiatrists. You know, we use this technique of motivational enhancement where we're not pointing out faults, or we're not pointing out various or telling the individual what he should or shouldn't do, but rather we're asking questions to get them to talk about it and to get them to really think about the negative impact. And then it's almost like a balance, as the negative consequences outweigh the positive potential perceived benefits. That's when one starts to want to make that change.
Absolutely. And I think goals. Harrison wanted, he would come and go with being able to work. He wanted to get out and to work and to re-engage in society and to rekindle friendships. And so thinking about how marijuana was impacting that was important too. We have some questions here. Harrison, thank you for sharing your story. Multiple people said that. Dr. Stanchu, are studies done with cannabis that is smoked or ingested in some other way? And are studies sensitive to differences in the way cannabis is used when looking at results and making conclusions?
So as we've seen from the randomized control trials that I presented over the last couple of slides, it's pretty a wide variability there. Some, for example, use the THC that was administered intravenously. Others use THC that was smoked or used as a tablet, ingested. It's pretty much all over the place. Part of the reason thinking about studies involving cannabis in general has to do with the way that cannabis is categorized in that
Mhm.
CSA class 1, same with heroin and other ones. It's really challenging to go through all the hoops and get permission to conduct these studies. So in a way that that categorization hinders the research that's being done on it.
Yeah, and that was basically our next question. Are there studies with illegal THC products, Delta products? Yeah, okay. So many people think it's harmless or good for you. And I think you talked about that in your
Right, right.
presentation,
Yeah, and
right?
there's certainly, to me, this is a fascinating botanical. Some people, general population may derive risk. Certainly, it's um, those with mental health conditions are more sensitive. If you were to look at the 60% of the medications behind the pharmacist's counter, they're derived from botanicals to some
Mhm.
extent. You don't have the raw plant in there, but you have one constituent that comes from a plant that someone isolated. They ran clinical trials with, they determined what condition, what dose, what route of administration. So I'm optimistic and hopeful that eventually we'll be able to explore this plant just like that, and see what components are beneficial, what dose. Um, I'm fairly optimistic about the positive potential of CBD in some conditions,
Mm.
but obviously concerned about the impact of THC alone, especially in those with schizophrenia, anxiety, mood disorders. Certainly that's been shown to have some negative implications.
That leads to our next question. What's being done to educate practitioners who approve medical marijuana cards about the potential negative effects of THC? My son had a documented history of anxiety and was provided a card and prescription with 29% THC. Severe hallucinations and schizophrenia ensued.
Yeah, that's a challenge. The medical cannabis programs across all states, um, the indications are not based on science. These are not indications that are supported by science, but rather just um, whoever requests and introduces it. For example, in states like Alabama, one could get certified for cannabis for depression, for anxiety, even though we know that that's not something evidence based. Across all medical or mental health conditions, most states have the indication for PTSD,
Mhm.
which may have some evidence there. I know here in New Hampshire, for example, the mental health conditions for which one could get approved would be autism, um, PTSD. Those are the two main ones. There's also um, for opioid use disorder cravings. However, the certification has to be done only by an addiction medicine expert in order to get approved for that. But as far as education, when I was last part of the therapeutic monitoring oversight board, there was talks about requiring those who certified to do certain education activities, learn more about the endocannabinoid system. But right now, anyone can really certify. So I'm not aware of any robust efforts going on right now.
Okay. We also had done a CBD webinar. You'll find that on onwardnh.org on the education page because I see some questions in here about CBD. So you might want to check that out, folks watching us today. From Chris, hi Harrison, do you remember progression, smaller thought or mood changes before your initial psychosis besides your anxiety? So,
Um, The only thing I can really say to that is that I've actually, I've been on Facebook recently, and it'll bring up like posts that you made from like 10 years ago or whatever. And there's some posts that have come up from April of 2010. So this would have been 2 months before my break, the psychosis. And I was saying some odd things on Facebook. And I just actually ran into that recently. Other than that, I don't really, it cropped up pretty quickly and severely. And I don't know necessarily. I was smoking I was smoking marijuana when I had my initial thought of, what if I'm Jesus, Harrison, Christ? And so that one thought took me down the rabbit hole. But as far as prior to the psychosis, no, other than some addictive tendencies that had come up and substance use, yeah, it happened fast. So
Definitely did. And we do have someone who said smoking marijuana has saved my life on a number of occasions. I have major depressive disorder. After my regular meds have worn off at the end of the day, there are days that the pain is intolerable. Marijuana is the one thing that put me at ease. These studies and testimonies seem biased.
I hear those type of stories. I'm not saying that that's incorrect. Certainly, personal experiences are important. The studies that I presented pertain to the outcomes from a large number of patients that were enrolled. So when I talk about the evidence, I'm talking about evidence at a population scale, not so much about individual experiences. I have no doubt that there's lots of people that benefit. Like I said at the beginning, I think it's important to have an open mind, but here we look at what the literature tells us.
Yes, and with psychosis, it is of concern. This person's talking about depression.
Mhm.
Yep, an important point. We have email addresses in the chat, and we're coming to the end of our time together. So, Dr. Stanchu and Harrison, words of wisdom, anything you want to leave our audience with before we sign off?
Sure, I think it's a botanical that's just gaining some traction in terms of exploration, research. Like I said, I think there's some promising potential outcomes with the CBD, one of the many components of this plant. There's certainly some risk associated with THC. From a medical professional standpoint, I don't think we have enough to really endorse the use. Certainly not by patients that have mental health conditions. But hopefully, in the next few years, we'll know more about cannabinoids and whether there's any way to utilize them properly for the benefit of our patients. So just be patient. I'm cautiously optimistic.
Thank you for that. Harrison, how about you?
Well, I'm not really here to say that it's good or bad. I can only speak to, my own experiences. And I wouldn't have smoked it for 15 straight years if it was all terrible. So, it had its place in my life. At this point, I'm not able to do it, but you know what? There are people in my situation. There are people in other situations where it's beneficial. And I would just say, no matter what, be hopeful. Um, Recovery is possible. I never thought I would be myself again. I looked in the mirror for 12 years and didn't know who was looking back. And at this point, I just think, yeah, I think it's been hard on my family. It's been hard on me, but overcoming these things is possible. It is possible.
Yes, and I would echo that.
Mhm.
So thank you both, Harrison and Dr. Stanchu, for joining us today. Just a reminder, a recording of today's discussion will be posted on the education page of onwardnh.org. You will receive an email in the next couple of days, which will include links for the website along with the evaluation. Please do fill that out. Also, the survey is here in the chat. You could click on that and hopefully it will pop up when the webinar finishes too. Once you complete that survey, you'll get a certificate of attendance. If you have any questions or comments, reach out to me, mwagner@naminh.org. We look forward to having you join us for our next webinar on Thursday, May 30th at noon. We're going to be joined by Dr. Mohammed El Sayed, and we're going to talk about tardive dyskinesia. Until then, take care, folks. Thank you.